Not even Jesus could reduce the Christian life to a single commandment. When Jesus asked in the gospel we read this weekend, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus gives us the twofold commandment in response. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And it's important that we recognize that Jesus gives these two commands very explicitly. It's not like we can simply say, well, I will love my neighbor and I'll do it so well and so completely that in doing so, I'll be loving God and that will be enough. No, Jesus says we have to love our neighbor and love God. And it's not like we can say, well, the love of God is the highest love. It's the most important thing. It's the only thing that lasts for eternity. So just as long as my devotion to God is strong enough, it doesn't matter what I do to my neighbor. We can't do that either. Jesus calls that hypocrisy. So we have to do both. We have to love God and love our neighbor. And put together, we call this the Great Commandment. But I think we know that. I think we know this is true already. So this weekend, I'd like to focus instead on how Jesus says we are to love. And Jesus says we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our soul. I'd like to focus on that beautiful few words, to love with all our heart. What does that mean? What does that look like? What does it look like for you and for me? To be literally wholehearted should be a goal of human maturity, that we are capable of being integrated and to be able to do what we intend to do. But we are, by nature, because of our fallen nature, fragmented. And Pope Francis speaks about this often, that we are fragmented particularly by the forces of the world, by the forces of media, social media, and consumerism that seek to pull us in many different directions. Because if we are fragmented, if we are not in touch with our own heart and soul, then we'll buy more stuff. This is the consumer world's goal. And Pope Francis, we know, speaks about this often. So Pope Francis invites us to come back to our own heart in a new document he's written just this past week called Dilexit Nos, which translates as He loved us, that Jesus has loved us. And Pope Francis' invitation is for us to rediscover the Sacred Heart of Jesus. But he begins with asking us to discover our own heart first. What does it mean for us to be wholehearted? How do I love somebody, anybody, with my whole heart, my whole self? So often we desire to do that, but we fail. Even our spouse, even our parents, our children, the people we want to love the most, we might find ourselves falling short and finding we love, but we also sin against them. We also do things wrong. How do we move beyond that? Again, that's a symptom of our fallen human nature. So what do we do? Well, there's a number of things we can do to try to love more fully and love with our whole heart. I remember when I first began seminary, I wanted to give my whole self to Jesus. I was sincere in my devotion, my desire to be completely wholeheartedly giving myself to God. The problem was, there was so much of myself that I did not yet know. There was so much of myself which was hidden from me. And for me, my formation as a priest was all important, but for me, going to therapy was the most important thing I could do to unlock those parts of myself that I was not aware of or didn't have access to or have really mastery over. And well, I'm still a work in progress, as we all are, but for me, therapy, counseling, was a really significant piece of coming to give myself the capacity to more effectively direct my whole self toward God in prayer and in devotion. That's certainly one thing which we all may need to do from time to time. Any tools of self-discovery or self-knowledge can be important for us to discover more fully our whole self so we can give our whole selves to God and to others more effectively. But there's also so much we can do in prayer as well. And this is really what Pope Francis is inviting us to in Dilexit Nos, this new encyclical. And there's a beautiful passage he talks about. In the first chapter or two, he speaks about our heart, learning to find our heart as the center of ourselves. But he says, when we still ourselves and really go inward, he said we can hear the beating of our own heart. But then he says, but more deeply we hear the beating of another heart, the heart of Christ, the sacred heart of Jesus under the surface. And it's by meditating upon the heart of Jesus that Pope Francis, we can learn to love more fully as well. That we allow ourselves to be overtaken by Jesus. We allow ourselves to be transformed by him. So we actually can increase our capacity to love and to be loved by focusing on Jesus' heart. Jesus' heart was a human heart like ours. He was fully human. But Jesus' heart was also divine. He was able to have divine love and human love in his heart. And in doing so, he was able to give himself so completely, so utterly for his mission, for the life of the world, and to each of us personally. And the more we meditate upon the heart of Jesus, the more we gaze upon his heart, then the more able we become to be transformed by him. That's hard work. It's often painful work. And the image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, if you're familiar with it, of course, is that image of the heart of Jesus sitting outside his chest. And it has flames of love emerging from it, but also is surrounded by thorns and pierced by a lance or a sword, representing the passion of Jesus. That the work of real deep love is hard work. It costs us, it may hurt to fully give ourselves to anyone, including God. It's hard work, which is why we don't all do it all the time. So for us to meditate upon the Sacred Heart of Jesus is a way we can grow in love. And this encyclical, Pope Francis goes back over all the scriptures which speak of the love of Jesus, and then goes through almost the history of the Sacred Heart as an image and as a concept in prayer, going back to many of the wonderful mystic saints throughout the Middle Ages, and then coming to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, who received the great vision or revelation of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in Paray-le-Monial in France in the 16th or 17th century, that really gave shape to what we now think of as a Sacred Heart devotion. And Pope Francis invites us to rededicate ourselves to this wonderful ancient devotion. But he says this devotion takes us in two directions. It takes us into personal spiritual experience, but also takes us into communal missionary encounter. And in doing so, he's picking up again that twofold commandment, that if we are to commit ourselves to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, we are driven to love God all the more, but we're also driven to love humanity, our neighbour, all the more as well. And Pope Francis gives a chapter to each of these great loves. So this beautiful encyclical, which I'm just scraping the surface of right now, I'll put a link to in the description below, which will take some time, and there'll be hard copies available soon once it's published. But I invite you, if you get the chance, to read or listen to whatever you can of Pope Francis' teaching on the Sacred Heart of Jesus as our way to learn to be loved and to love all the more, so we can love God and our neighbour with all of our heart.